Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NeoSystems CMMC Town Hall. Now I'd like to introduce your host, Ed Bassett from NeoSystems. Ed?
Hi, thanks, Don, and welcome everyone to our continuing series of Town Hall Ask Me Anything sessions on the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. Our guest today is Matt Travis. I want to mention at the start that we are recording these sessions as part of our community outreach to the Defense Industrial Base. Our resident artist, Wade Forbes, will be sketchnoting the session, and we'll send that out to the audience after the event. Our focus at NeoSystems as a managed service provider is on organizations seeking certification, and that's primarily who we have in our audience today. Thanks for joining. If you have any questions from the audience, please send those in on the Q&A feature within Zoom, and I'll try to work those into my conversation with Matt. I'll start with the introduction of Matt Travis. He is the first CEO of the CMMC accreditation body. They are the nation's sole authorized provider of cybersecurity certification credentials for the Defense Industrial Base. Previously, Matt served as the first deputy director at CISO, the nation's leading civilian cybersecurity agency. Prior to this, he was deputy undersecretary for national protection within Department of Homeland Security. Before entering the government service in 2018, he was vice president of Homeland Security for Cadmus, a security, energy, and environmental professional services firm. He joined Cadmus when the security consultancy he co-founded, Obsidian Analysis, was acquired by Cadmus in 2016. He started out his career as a naval officer, serving at sea as well as in the White House. Matt is at the very center of the work to scale up the CMMC ecosystem as the accreditation body transitions from the sort of volunteer-led effort that got it started to the professionally staffed nonprofit that we see today under his leadership. Matt, thanks for joining us today. Oh, Matt's frozen. That's not good. I see a picture, but it's not moving.
Ed, do you have me?
I have you. Yep, you were frozen for a minute. I was saying
Okay.
Thanks for joining us. Were you able to hear the intro?
I was, and if you have more trouble, let me know. I'll see if it's on my end, but I've got you loud and clear.
Sounds good. Well, yeah, thanks for joining us today. DoD has been really busy pushing out some CMMC 2.0 materials, a new standard assessment guide, scoping guidance. You know, we've all been reading this, digesting this. I'm sure for you at the AB, this has really fueled a lot of work. You've got to do some retooling of things that were done under the previous version. Just give us a flavor of what your top priorities have been over the last couple of months and what's going on right now.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And when I was frozen, I was just thanking everyone for joining and good to be with you and your team. It's been obviously pretty busy since CMMC 2.0 was announced on November 4th. So in terms of what we've been really pressing on is twofold: updating all the materials to reflect 2.0, the 2.0 framework, to include the whole training side. We actually had certified CMMC professional classes underway when 2.0 was announced, so we're developing the Delta training to add to those classes. But probably first and foremost, the priority has been to get assessment started in the interim voluntary period that the department has laid out. So as the DoD acknowledged, the rulemaking for 2.0 is likely going to take a while, maybe 9 months, could be a year and a half, 2 years. But they recognize the investment that the DIB and the ecosystem has made already, and want to go ahead and allow on a voluntary basis those companies to get certified. And so we are pushing to get that documentation finished and getting all the T's crossed and I's dotted, so that assessments, voluntary assessments, but still certifications can begin here in early 2022.
That sounds pretty cool. Speaking of the training, of the audience question about that, the audience members asking, will the RP and CCP training and certifications change as we go into 2022?
It will. And so we're on the RP side, the registered practitioner. This is the consultative side of the ecosystem, those individuals and companies that work with the DIB to get them ready and prepare them for CMMC. We'll be offering what we call the Delta training, free of charge here in the coming months. And on the formal individual certification side, that CCA level 1, the certified CMMC assessor for level 1 assessments, has essentially gone away because the mandatory requirements for level 1 are now just self-assessment and instead of a third-party certification. We're still going to work with the department to see if they'll recognize voluntary level 1 assessments. But nonetheless, we've taken a lot of that content in the level 1 assessor curriculum and moved it into the Certified CMMC Professional, or CCP. So we're essentially taking that level 1 and reintegrating it into that entry-level position of the CCP. So a lot of changes being made to ensure that the ecosystem is up to speed with the changes to 2.0.
So you mentioned the possibility of sort of a voluntary level 1 assessment. Would that be for companies that would prefer to have a C3PAO do that rather than do it themselves?
Yeah, we certainly recognize why the department opted to transition level 1 to self-assessment in terms of the mandatory contract requirements. They were looking for ways to ease the cost burden, especially to small and medium-sized businesses. But when you think about it, if you're the president or owner of a level 1 company, I think I would rather have a 3-year certification rather than have to self-attest every year. And when you think about those level 1 practices, it's not nearly as an extensive assessment as level 3. So frankly, the costs are much less. And so we want to make that an option for those companies who may only be required to self-attest, but would just assume get a third-party certification to have that 3-year CMMC certification. That's got to be something that's approved by duty. We can certainly offer that. We can certainly authorize the C3POs to grant that, but the department's going to agree to have to recognize those certifications in lieu of the self-attestation.
Got it. Yeah, I can see a lot of reasons. One of which being if somebody's self-attesting, if that CEO who has to self-attest is not that confident that they're interpreting it correctly, they might prefer to have someone who is coming to them certified to give them an interpretation that's accurate.
That's exactly right, Ed. And that's frankly the notion of where those RPs and RPOs also come in. We certainly encourage those level 1 companies, if they're going to go ahead and self-attest, to get help, to have that second set of eyes to look at what you're actually attesting to. Because if you listen to some of the lawyers who follow CMMC, and if you kind of read between the lines in terms of how the Federal Register language is being written, I think the False Claims Act comes into play, whistleblowing comes into play in terms of making sure that those level 1 companies who are self-attesting are doing that accurately and truthfully. Get certified is a way to kind of absolve yourself of that liability and have another party come in and certify that you've met those level 1 requirements.
Makes a lot of sense. So speaking of the next period, the rulemaking process, the DoD is going to be going through. They're going to be saying that 9 to 24 months. We know from past experience that can be a pretty protracted process. Other than the things that you just mentioned around voluntary assessments, getting those recognized, other sort of major focuses during that rulemaking period, are there things on your plate that are dependent on that rulemaking, or things you can move ahead before you see the contents there?
Well, ultimately, the final disposition of the CMMC conformance regime will be dependent on what it looks like at the back end of rulemaking. That's not going to affect the interim voluntary program, which will be under 2.0 conditions, right? So any company that goes ahead as a first mover to go ahead and get certified here in the next year will be under 2.0 conditions. But we're looking at also hearing from DoD what the POAM policy is going to be, getting the details on that. I know a draft has been written, but it's going through the approval process. They've talked about incentives to encourage more of these companies to go ahead and get certified and not wait for the requirement to come into your contract. And so the rulemaking is not going to affect the interim voluntary program, but it certainly will, at the back end in terms of the final requirements and all of the actual DFARS rules. What we're doing in addition to trying to get those voluntary assessments started is also working really to promote the ecosystem and increase the awareness within not only the DIB about the value of getting certified. And when you think about, I really believe that CMMC over time will become the coin of the realm in federal acquisition. It shows your clients, customers, your competitors, your employees that you take cybersecurity seriously. And so you'll be seeing more from the AB in terms of a promotional campaign to really encourage companies, go ahead and get started. Don't wait for this to show up as a requirement. It's never too early to invest in cybersecurity. And if you just look at the threat landscape, it's obvious why companies need to be implementing those 800-171 practices. At the same time, we're going to also be very vocal in encouraging Americans to get into CMMC as a profession. We need assessors to really mature the ecosystem to full capacity. And so we'll be embarking on a whole campaign to encourage individuals who may be intimidated about getting into cybersecurity because they may not have background in coding or what have you, but becoming an assessor doesn't necessarily require those deep technical skills. It requires obviously, some knowledge of cybersecurity, but it's more of a, conformity assessment. And so we want to bring in Americans, whether it's a full-time job or a side hustle, into CMMC. So we're going to be pretty busy on that. We're going to be
Oh, you froze up again.
So we've got our plate full.
Got a little bit of a freeze, but I think we only missed a half a sentence, so we'll fill in the gaps. So, from a regulatory perspective, thinking about the impacts of that rulemaking on the DIB, CMMC will not be in the contracts until that effort is concluded. We're pretty clear on that. But today we already have DFARS 7019 and 7020. Those are in contracts today. They're helping with enforcement of the NIST 800-171 requirements. DoD has teased out the incentives that you just talked about for voluntary certification ahead of a contractual requirement. We're seeing a lot of pressure from prime contractors, being a real direct motivator to DIB companies. They got to keep their customers happy, and their customers, the upstream prime, maybe more directly to them than the government. So they're enforcing FAR and DFARS clauses, et cetera. So given that everything that's in CMMC up to level 2 is already required, except the attestation and certification part, what really changes when CMMC becomes a contractual requirement? Like what's new other than that we now have to self-attest to get the certification? Anything?
Yeah, I would say two things. That is certainly a fair question. When you think about NIST 800-171, we look at that as that is the technical model. That is the standard. But how that standard should be implemented and how DoD is going to assess implementation is where CMMC really comes in, which is why, in addition to just having the NIST framework, you need the assessment guide and the assessment process, the CAP document that we'll be publishing. So it's not just looking at 800-171 and that's it. CMMC is really taking 171, implementing it, and understanding how it's going to be assessed to meet DoD requirements. So that's point one. And then point two, I wouldn't minimize the importance of the certification itself, right? I mean, that's what this is all about, because we all know that we've tried the self-attestation. There's been an evolution in terms of how industry has either been encouraged or required to prove their investments in cybersecurity to meet that minimum baseline that we all know is not elaborate. We're not asking companies to install quantum computing. This is the basic blocking and tackling of good cyber hygiene. But we are now at the point now, given the threat landscape, and we know the impact to the sector itself from our cyber threat actors, we need to certify that these companies are meeting those requirements and meeting that standard. And that is what CMMC is about. It's no longer taking a word for it. It's no longer treating this cybersecurity like any other term and condition on the back of a contract. It is to certify with third parties that these requirements are being met. And it sounds simple, but that's a big difference than just treating it as a term and condition, like you use E-Verify and you pay your taxes and all that other stuff.
Agree. It's definitely impactful. Audience question kind of related to this. This audience member is asking, is NIST 800-171 certification required prior to getting CMMC? And I think you were just kind of drawing the distinction that 171 doesn't really have a certification. It's not a certifiable standard, but CMMC puts that wrapper around the technical standard.
Yeah, exactly right, Ed. NIST 800-171 and then 172 for level 3. Those are just standards. NIST is not in the business of imposing conformance regimes. That's what CMMC is, and so there are no existing certification or conformance regimes for 800-171. This is going to obviously be the first and the largest. So if you have already had like ISO 27001, there are some other frameworks out there that certainly have overlapping practices, and certainly those will come into play if you've already been doing a lot of the things that 171 calls for under a different umbrella. That's what CMMC is about, is making sure these companies are implementing all those practices. But CMMC is the only place where we're going to be certifying that you're doing so.
go to audience question. You mentioned the 800-172. So they had a question about that. It says, of course, you can't speak for the DoD. However, in your opinion, do you anticipate that the CMMC level 3 assessment procedures will equate to CMMC level 2 with the 800-172 enhancements? If so, why do you think DoD is holding out on the assessment guide for level 3?
So Ed, let me take a moment, since I was frozen at the beginning, just to reiterate that nothing I say here today represents, is on behalf of the Department of Defense. That's normally a disclaimer I said, but I think I might have been frozen. So as you mentioned, I'm not speaking for DoD or an independent organization. Having said that, the assessment guide for level 3 is under construction. I don't think it's that far away. It generally is going to speak to those 172 practices. And so for a company to get level 3, to be required to get level 3, they'll still have to get level 2 from a C3PAO. And then the DIBCAC will come on top and do those additional 172 practices. And the combination of that is what will give you a level 3 certification.
That's good. And I'm glad you repeated the disclaimer. That did get lost in the freeze. So thanks for getting that out and keeping us on the right side of the legality. I want to circle back a little bit. You mentioned one of your big initiatives is going to be encouraging people to join the ecosystem and getting that. And I think as we look at this scaling up, one of the large challenges has got to be the people side. We've got a significant shortage of cyber skilled people in our workforce to fill cyber positions across the board. And so want to kind of inquire a little more detail about your approach to attracting the right sort of talent in the right quantities for trainer and assessor roles. I guess a couple of questions. One is, do you see it as a potential bottleneck? And what are some of the things you're doing to widen that out?
Yeah, Ed, it's a very good question. And I'll address it this way. I'm very confident that we've got a very good structure in place with our partners to produce enough assessors. We have upwards now, I think, almost 80 licensed training providers. These are companies who are already in kind of the professional education, continuing education business. They have signed up to be partners to teach CMMC. There are 20 publishing houses who are signed up to produce CMMC content that those training providers will buy and use to teach the CMMC courses for all the different levels of assessors. We have Scantron as our national partner then to be able to administer the exams, the high stakes exams for the professional certification across the country and virtually. And so that is all in place. What the X factors you kind of hinted here in the question is, do we have enough Americans who want to go ahead and add this to their professional qualifications, or even get into CMMC as the first step into the cybersecurity community? I think this is a great opportunity to do so. When I was at CISO, we struggled to hire cybersecurity talent. It's a tight labor market overall in the country, regardless of the sector, as we know. But I think some people often are intimidated by, well, I couldn't do cybersecurity because I didn't come up in a computer science background. And cybersecurity needs a lot of different skill sets. Cybersecurity needs good writers and good analysts. It's not just people who can pull together a network defense architecture. And so the assessment of CMMC certainly requires cybersecurity knowledge. But I think it's a level that's much more accessible to general Americans. And when you think about the opportunity to become an assessor, whether it's a full-time job or a kind of a side job, it's a very flexible profession. I think the analogy is looking at the appraisers in the CMMI community, where it can be pretty lucrative if you want to work a lot. And it's important work, and it's intellectually compelling, and it's you're going to meet a lot of people, and so I think it's a great professional option for people. But to your point, that's the X factor. We got to make sure that we can produce enough individuals who want to be assessors to go work for the over 400 C3PAO companies that have signed up to do assessments. They're going to need people to hire, and that's really what we're going to be pushing for.
Sounds good. Audience member asks, have you consulted with the DoD on using the Info Assurance Scholarship candidates for this effort? Are you familiar with that program?
Not off the top of my head in terms of how that title. We are certainly looking at, during rulemaking, what's the final requirements going to be for the permanent program in terms of qualifications and background for assessment team members and the different roles. So I'll take a note of that. But on that particular one, I don't know that my team has consulted with DoD on that one, but we'll certainly take that on board.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it either, but if there's some scholarship situation that would make it easier from a barrier to entry, potential financial barrier to entry, that sounds promising for sure. On the people side, one of the audience members is asking, how do you find an accredited firm for CMMC assessor training? So what's the path there?
So go to our website, cmmcab.org, and you'll see a marketplace section of our website where we list all of our authorized partners, whether they are existing RPs and RPOs, the consultant side to help DIB companies prepare for CMMC, or as the question asks, on the training side, there are licensed training providers, and many of them are already holding classes for that entry level for the assessor profession, the CCP, the Certified CMMC Professional. So it's at our website, and I know it's not, it's a very antique website. That's one of the reasons we're going to be issuing a new one here, hopefully this quarter, but bear with the current one, but you should be able to find all those licensed training providers by looking at the top of the page.
Sounds good. Good. A couple of questions about the changes in CMMC 2.0, deleting out the CMMC unique requirements and aligning just with the NIST standard. So this has obviously some really nice benefits for government-wide consistency and the ability of NIST to evolve that standard using proven methods they already have in place for standards making. But the Delta 20 that we've taken away from CMMC, the new level 2, included things like integrity, availability. Audience member mentions backup and restore. This shifts the burden for those items back to the companies. In your opinion, is that where that belongs, or do you think at some point those might get added back into the CMMC umbrella?
So I'll just kind of recast what DoD said themselves when 2.0 was announced, which was, for one, I think the driver on why they scaled that back and took away those CMMC bespoke practices and tailored it back to align more directly with 800-171 was to try to make it less customized and I think more adoptable writ large throughout the federal executive civilian branch or even among our international partners. So making it, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Salazar said back in the beginning of the internal review, we want to make it more accessible, more streamlined, less complicated. I think that was the obvious place to do that. The question raises a good point, which is, okay, well, those maturity practices, there's still value in there. And where does the burden fall from there? I think companies who truly take CMMC not as just a list of things to do, but as investments to change the business culture of their organization and to live CMMC, not to just prove that you've done a few things, will want to go ahead and continue on with those maturity practices and the processes and probably the more rigorous documentation that those added on 20 required. But nonetheless, there's upside to making CMMC more accessible. We're very early on here. People forget that this really hasn't even started yet. So we won't. Where the current 800-171 model might be fortified.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, any company that decides not to do backup and restore because it's not in the CMMC model anymore is probably missing out on a few other threats they ought to pay attention to, like ransomware. I don't know, just a thought. Quite a question about interpretation. We had a lot of questions about, what does the standard mean? And we read through the materials and it's not always 100% clear how it applies to a particular circumstance. So if you can't get that answer by reading the materials, do you feel there should be an authoritative resource that DIB members can go to determine if a solution is sufficient to meet CMMC? And I'm sure you get those questions of the AB. So is this a role for the AB or the DoD or some other party? How do you feel DIB members should resolve those kind of questions?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'm not sure I'm going to have an answer just yet. We've thought a lot about this, and as an accreditation body, we don't own the standard. So I do think that in terms of adjudicating interpretation questions, we're certainly through the assessment guides, the CMMC assessment process documents, and all the other, the body of knowledge. We hope the assessors and the DIB companies will be able to, understand how CMMC needs to be implemented. and that there's less gray area. But when gray area does come up, whether there's a help desk that the PMO stands up, or NIST, or one of the DoD partners, maybe Carnegie Mellon, I think that there's going to be a need for that, because when we get questions from assessors, I don't know that we've got the authority to render judgment on technical issues with regard to the standard. So I think the PMO AB NIST owes the community probably a better answer on how that's going to be handled in terms of institutionalizing technical assistance.
And I think you kind of hit on the key item is when a DIB member interprets it one way and they build their system with that decision in mind, and then an assessor comes along and has a different interpretation and they don't agree. So they need some referee, some authoritative source they can go to get clarification on those things. And some of them they can work out, but there's some where it may be needing to. A help desk is a great idea. I think that would be cool.
ISO will play a bit into this, because ultimately we'll be attaining ISO recognition and therefore accrediting the C3POs under ISO 17011. And so there are some ISO protocols in terms of how these things are adjudicated. We've got to work with DoD on making sure we're meeting the ISO requirements as well on that. Cool.
Another question on the sort of assessment process, how the government-led assessments that happen at level 3 interact with the assessments that AB accredited folks will be doing, the C3POs will be doing for level 2. So you mentioned that the level 2 assessment will be done by a C3PO first, and then the DIBCAC folks will just do the level 3 piece. Is there a necessity to keep those guys on the same page in terms of training methods, interpretation, consistency? They're looking at different controls, so perhaps not, but what if the DIBCAC folks who come in second disagree with something that they see in some of those level 2 controls? Has there been discussion about how to keep that in sync?
Not only discussion, Ed, there is active collaboration. So first point, the AB itself, we trained the DIBCAC assessors. They went through our own classes that we've been conducting over the past year for provisional assessors. We had DIBCAC assessor candidates in those classes. And so pretty much everyone that DIBCAC, that this an assessor went through our classes. We've now done train the trainer, so they're now training their own with instructors that we author, or that we endorsed, and we meet with DIBCAC weekly. Was on with them yesterday, and so very much want to make sure we collaborate on templates. We collaborate on some of the technical interpretation issues, making sure, because right now DIBCAC's been assessing those candidate C3POs. To former level 3, now level 2. And so those assessments have been going on since the summer. And we do want to have consistency. And so when a company gets level 2 from a C3PO, they go to DIBCAC for level 3, that there's not a separate set of standards or process or procedures.
Very cool. So we're just about out of time. I do have a lot of audience questions that I was not able to get to in the 30 minutes we have today. So apologize to those audience members. Come back. I'm sure we'll have Matt on again, and we'll take this conversation a little further. I just want to ask kind of one wrap-up question for you today, Matt. I'd like to ask about how we can achieve better results for the effort. We all have limited resources, so we want to do the right things. As you're speaking with companies that are looking to interpret what CMMC means to them, and they're trying to sort out which systems and data it applies to, how to react, the risk is that they get caught up in sort of technical regulatory rabbit holes. Maybe that's a waste of time. What's your one piece of advice to those listening today to help us stay focused on the right things and make the most out of the efforts we have available?
And I would say, first and foremost, engage the ecosystem and consult with we've got, several hundred individuals, or several thousand individuals, and several hundred companies who are registered practitioners. They've taken our class. We've done background checks. They are the authorized consultants on this. That's the first place to go for help. These is what these folks exist to do, is help the companies understand how do we even get started in CMMC, and they'll walk them through, understanding what's on their network, what's in their environment, understand what CMMC requires, and then go from there. So there's help there, Ed. So all defense contractors, I would encourage you, get engaged. Don't wait till this becomes a requirement in your contract. And there are those practitioners standing by to help.
Sounds good. Well, thanks very much. I appreciate you joining us here. Like I say, we have quite a few more questions, so maybe I'll try to coalesce those into a round 2, and we'll invite you to come back if your schedule permits. So thanks very much. Thanks to Wade for sketchnoting this. We'll send that out to the attendees afterwards. And thank you for the attendees for your time and attention and all the great questions you sent in. Please join us for future town hall meetings. Our next session is going to be Wednesday, January 19th, a week from today at our usual time, 1 p.m. Eastern. If you don't have the details there, please visit our website, neosystemscorp.com, where all the info is there. Thanks.
Thanks, Ed.